And hello, everyone. Welcome. This is episode 32 of Sport, Leadership, and Social Change, our webinar series. We've been running for a few years now. I want to introduce Ariana Kingerski because she's here and you can probably see her on the screen. And I just want to thank her for the support that she provided for the several months that we've been running together. And great to see all sorts of people showing up. We'll record this, of course, as well and post that and send that out to everyone. If you couldn't make it for today, we'll make sure you get the recording. Thanks for coming. Want to remind people that they can post in the chat, they can ask questions, make comments. We'll pay attention and try and weave you in to the conversation. It's very much a conversation where we're all learning together. And I've got two fabulous guests today. I've got a couple more interviews lined up that I'll post as our bonus reels, or I might try to just have another webinar. We'll see how we can organize things. I want to acknowledge the fact that Rural Roads as a campus, Rural Roads University, is on the lands of the Lekwungen and Kusutsun First Nations. And we, of course, have a responsibility to at least acknowledge the gaps in our history, some of the harms committed, and make a real commitment to reconciling our practice with our principles, do a better job, even though we're not directly responsible for inflicting harms upon our First Nation people. We are definitely responsible for fixing it. And I'm really proud of some of the initiatives ongoing within our community at Railroads University. And we are very close partners with the Indigenous people because we're definitely on unceded territories. And in fact, those who claim those territories have given them back, which is great, and has really put us in a wonderful position to be direct partners. Welcome, and yes, great to see people posting in the chat, letting us know where you're at and where you're coming from. Making sure you add your title or your organization to your names as well. That's always wonderful to see. I'm Walinga. I'm a professor in the School of Communication and Culture. I focus a lot of research on sport and leadership, organizational cultural development, cultural integrity in sport, especially right now with many challenges that we're navigating, like this little path that heads down into our campus. I always like to show our campus a little bit because it is outstanding and a wonderful place to learn and reflect and learn from nature, you know, the diversity that surrounds us. I listened to a guy on CBC recently say that, well, you know, we're geared to be afraid of diversity, and think, oh, I don't know about that. I see little kids being just curious about difference, and I think we have a lot to learn from that. We certainly stare out at, well, in this little colonial artifact as well on our campus that reminds us daily of work that we need to do to decolonize. I'm in Alberta right now, so I like to point out that you can't really tell whether that was winter or summer. We're on the island of Vancouver Island, and this bridge is our emblem of our School of Communication and Culture, where we try to emphasize the idea of minding the gap before we attempt to bridge the gap. So let's try and understand before we start canceling people or failing to build the bridge or building a bridge that makes all sorts of assumptions about the other side. This webinar really talks about sport and the way that sport has so many principles embedded within it, inherent truths that we can learn from sport, but also within sport as we participate in sport. And sport has one of the greatest reaches of any human endeavor in the world. You can participate in so many different ways, not just as an athlete, but also as a spectator, volunteer, official, administrator, so many ways, and so much to learn from it when it's being delivered in a positive way. It can be used as such a powerful platform, of course, and we've seen our athletes and sport participants leverage that platform for social justice and to pursue causes of great importance. At Rural Roads, we try and highlight the same kind of thing. You know, we're learning principles, but we want to make sure we actually give you all a chance to apply those principles as well. And I find that a fascinating way to think about sport. You know, that little skinny boat I ride in every morning, and I was out today on the Calgary Reservoir. It gives me something daily. And the work is in taking those lessons and applying them to other contexts within your life, right? So we try and do the same thing. It's central to our learning, teaching, and research model here at Rural Roads. We also acknowledge at Rural Roads prior learning. So whether it's professional work that you've accomplished and that you bring as learning as a student into your cohort, into your program, But athletes have the same kind of professional experience, right? They've trained, they've competed internationally, and we invite athletes to come into our programs in the same way, where we acknowledge that kind of experience for credit. We have some cool things underfoot that I'm definitely getting behind, and those are, we have a course in sport leadership. We also have one that exists within our professional communication programs. But this is a little one that then turns into a micro credential that then turns into a course in our grad cert. Grad certs can then lead into or transfer into our master's. So we're very close to launching the grad cert now, but we have this sport leadership course starting in November. We do that in partnership with the CFL Players Association and multiple other players associations, as well as CSI Pacific. So we have all sorts of athletes, but also people from all walks of life operating within the sport world, participating in that course. So it's a good one. We have another one launching November 18th. Check out our website. All right, so that all leads us to this wonderful webinar in sport and leadership and social change, and the way that sport can really prompt positive social change. Today we have episode 32, Equity in Sport. Are things finally changing? There's a ton afoot around equity in sport, not just gender equity, but equity for everyone, right? Of all abilities, races. And I welcome today Travers, who's a professor of sociology at Simon Fraser University with a research focus on the relationship between sport and social justice. They particularly focus on inclusion and exclusion of women, has worked a lot in the area of youth as well, and just has a recently published book that is worth exploring and we'll talk about today. And Jill Moffatt, who is a good friend of mine, a two-time Olympic rower and journalist. She's also co-founder of Momentum. And that's what's inspiring her in her journey into the academic realm, where she's pursuing a PhD now with Amanda Schweinbens, right, at Laurentian University, and focusing on elite athletes who are also mothers. And we had a great chat even before you all came in. I often wish we could record those chats too, because we often start digging into interesting topics. Reminding you to post any questions you have or comments that you have. We'll monitor and try and weave you in. Sometimes the conversation's really intense and it's hard to do it all, but we definitely will try, and we often have places for people to jump in and comment or ask a question or even join into the conversation. A little bit of contact information here, and I'll have more on this topic coming up, whether it's I'll be able to coordinate another webinar, or I'll just interview and record those and post those as well. And then we love to hear your ideas for webinars as well. And so let's get started. Thank you. All right, so I always introduce in a very minimal way and then start my first question with, can you please tell us a little bit about, and why don't we start with you, Travers, your journey into sport. So you've been an academic. I'm sure you have a broad life beyond that as well, and before that, but what's led you into sport as a topic for your research and your social justice and community work as well?
Well, I am an academic, but I think one of the reasons I am an academic is because my experiences, things that I observe, I'm curious about them, or annoyed, and I want to know why they happened the way they happened. I mean, I was born in 1962. It wasn't until 1974 that the US Supreme Court allowed girls to play Little League Baseball. It was 1976 in Canada, so that was too late for me. I probably wouldn't have been allowed to play anyway because, it wasn't what girls were supposed to do. But I started doing research related to sport after I already had a tenure track job, because I was the chair of my lesbian softball league. And we were I felt like we were on the verge of having to address issues related to transgender inclusion in our league. And I wanted it to be a good process. So I started doing research on other lesbian softball leagues in Canada and the United States to find out what their policies were. That's how it started. And I don't know, once I started, focusing on sport as an area of research, my career kind of took off, just because I had so much I wanted to say. And sometimes you know, when you're an academic, you're doing projects you think you should do, but it's hard to really put a lot of energy into them. Whereas when I started my sport research, I was like, I'm onto something really important. You know, and one of the big arguments that I made is sport, as it's currently constituted, genders citizenship as male and white and, you know, wealthy and able-bodied. And, you know, so it's not just this recreational, albeit like a, you know, a very monetized sport, but it says a lot about social inequality beyond sport.
Exactly. And I love your point about same, you know, I almost tried to distance myself from sport because I'd been an athlete for so long, and I thought, okay, time to do something different. And now I'm in the academic world. I need to be focusing on organizations. But once I did shift and welcome sport into my research, yeah, your passion just explodes because you really do care so much. And we are seeing so much unfold in the sport domain. Hey, all these
Yeah.
issues unfold. Yeah, it's exciting.
And also, before I started writing about sport, I'm remembering now that I started teaching intro to sociology in 1997, and I don't know why I did it, but I, you know, posed some questions that we would explore over the semester. And one of the questions that I asked is, should sport be sex segregated? You know, because sociology is challenging our taken for granted assumptions and beliefs. And the thing is, it worked so well in the classroom, you know, like people were, oh my God. And I think that, you know, and showing them, well, you know, research actually shows that, you know, there's this overlap, et cetera, that sport was not made male only by accident. It was very intentional. It's a heteropatriarchal white supremacist project. So, you know, sport resonates for students. You can talk about sport, whether they love it or hate it. It's a great teaching focus.
Yeah. And you can, even if you hate it, exactly, you still have something to say about it.
Mhm.
Right on. And your point about 74, 76, you know, I remember telling my daughter, who was well, all of them were multi-sport athletes, but Imogen saying, 76, like really? Couldn't believe like how recently that women rowers were allowed to be at the Olympics, allowed.
Oh no, and you know, sport in some ways has really remained behind other organizations. You know, to my knowledge, I am the first non-man to head coach at the 18U AAA youth baseball level, like to my knowledge. And you know, it's
Mind blowing.
2022 it was.
Yeah, and we'll get into that. You know, what is it that is so firmly entrenched in sport that keeps it in the Neanderthal age, really? Yeah, thank you. And Jill, tell us a little bit about your journey into sport, why you still want to pursue it in the
Yeah.
different, yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was interesting when you were saying about transitioning your research into sport, because that's kind of the journey I'm on. So I did my undergrad in health sciences and my master's in health information science, and I was really focused on gender equity, more within the healthcare system and around social and policy change. And I was an athlete during this time, so sport was super important to me. I wanted to be on the national team, but I never really saw the uh, relation to research or a career path in sport beyond my athletic career. And it wasn't until spending some time on the national team and seeing inequities and seeing how they impacted women athletes differently, that I kind of started to get a little bit more interested in gender equity specific to sport. I completed a fellowship in journalism at the University of Toronto after the Tokyo Olympics, and then I focused a little bit on athlete motherhood and hearing from athletes and some of the experiences they were having. And so then that kind of got me even a bit more interested in it. And then that has ultimately the, you know, things I've been involved with sport on the advocacy side, personal experiences within our own team culture and the crumbling of that, and you know, toxic and sport. I definitely found myself wanting to get more involved in sport, and obviously, sport is blowing up for women in a great way. Still so much work to be done. And so that made me want to pursue a PhD. So I'm going to be focusing on elite athlete motherhood. I just started last week, so I'm still far away from picking, what the actual research is going to be, but I'm really excited. And so I think I'm, very similar where I want to now have a career in sport to help with research and advocacy.
Yeah. And yeah, I should say Jill and I were on that little journey of toxicity together. And, I think a lot of people are within Canada experiencing the shift that Travers talks about, where these assumptions are being really deeply, finally revealed, but also questioned strongly, vociferously. People want change, and it's great to see, and we kind of have to keep that momentum going, right? The wave moving, because it can revert back so quickly, as we see in the States. All right, thank you so much. And yeah, we are right now. Sport is ripe with social issues. It's awesome. It's all surfacing kind of at once, so it can be tough to manage, frankly, and think about and write about. And I just feel overwhelmed all the time. I feel like there's about 100 different topics I want to pursue at all times. But sports also increasingly being kind of used as a platform. What's your take on sport and social justice? Do you think sport is a tool or vehicle for social justice or for injustice or both? Or what are you seeing right now? And we've got Tamara, I'll just admit her. There we go. What are you seeing right now in terms of justice and injustice? The Olympics were a pretty interesting case, the recent one, summer one, with some really great examples of change, like around athletes who were mothers, and Jill was saying there are 6 women on the podium and 3 of them had kids. But then we saw the hiring of the coach, the very questionable background, right, for the athletics in Canada. Yeah, and we saw the maltreatment of 2 boxers because of questions of being trans when they weren't, and what if they were, who cares? And so how do you think we're doing? Anybody want to start? Travers, go for it.
Sure. I think that it's really important to acknowledge that sport has always been integrated into racial capitalism, and that, this is just a structural reality that we need to understand. It's definitely about making money for people who already have a lot of money. I do think that sport can be a site of social justice. As there's a long history of athlete protest. I know that John Carlos and Tommy Smith, uh, I think it was the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, took the opportunity to protest against, poverty and inequality for African Americans. Right now I'm spending a lot of time watching the WNBA. One of the things I love about the WNBA, it's almost like a counter public. It's a place where, that is dominated by Black women, and they are mostly treated with respect. They're not expected all to be pretty and gender conforming and stuff like that. Although we certainly see with the recent Caitlin Clark moment, the misogynoir directed at Angel Reese,
Right.
which is absolutely unforgivable. But I just have to say, I was in Chicago last week, and I went to see this guy play. I saw Angel Reese play her last game of the season. And the thing that I loved about that, in Chicago, they love Angel Reese. She breathes, they're on their feet. She gets fouled, they're yelling. Like, they love her. And I saw all these kids, tons and tons of, Black little girls with their Angel Reese sign. And I think this is a really important place where, the possibilities for gender are so much more open-ended, and where, women are worth paying attention to. So it's, that's really good. But at the same time, I can't help watching that. I noticed that some of the best players, they don't have regular jobs. They're itinerant labor. Because we're looking at racial capitalism, this is what happens. It's like there are a lot of problematic dynamics, in spite of the many positives. I think that the WNBA is overall an incredibly positive force, but we can't forget that it's situated in a capitalist system, and there are problems. And the people who are in the arena, they have to have enough money to go. And now to even watch sports on TV, you have to pay for a streaming service. So it's really inaccessible in a lot of ways. But this leads to a point that I want to make about sport in general. One of the things we've seen, certainly in Canada, is that more money has been diverted towards high performance athletics. And high performance athletes will say not anywhere near enough, and I would agree with them. But what's happened is that community-based, recreation-based sport has been cut. So the kids that I coached, for example, in baseball, like it was AAA, so this is high performance youth baseball, their parents paid $2,500 in fees each season, and that didn't account travel costs. So we're not like this, to me, is an incredible shame. It's like any kid should have access to sport, and the level that they achieve should be based on their ability and their work ethic, not the fact that their parents make enough money or have the kind of flexibility to drive them around everywhere. Youth sports is particularly, problematic. And then there's the overarching context of sport as an arena which normalizes gender inequality. And we see this with female eligibility policies, and the International Olympic Committee has been like absolutely shameful in its handling. It finally admitted, after leading scientists of sex development said that so-called sex testing wasn't scientific at all. They've been saying it for 60 years. In 2021, they finally admitted that their testosterone test, their female eligibility requirements were unscientific, were not supported by scientific evidence. They apologized for the harm they did to the many women athletes who were subjected to these tests, some of whom were kicked out of sport, and this was horrible. But instead of playing a leadership role in developing a more inclusive model of sport, they just outsourced it to individual sport federations who have no hesitation about adopting trans exclusive policies and testosterone thresholds without any scientific credibility. They just do it anyway. So, it's a mixed bag. I love sport. I love participating in it. I love watching it. I love thinking about it, but it's really, a troubling ecosphere for so many reasons.
And you really hit on the capitalism issue, right? Where when money's at stake, it seems like everyone behaves badly, and it's so vulnerable. And the WNBA stresses me out for that reason. I feel like they're vulnerable to the same kind of pressures, and you see it between Clark and Reese, right? I love the word misogynoir. It's almost like there's these forces at play trying to fabricate some kind of violence and conflict between these women that wasn't real necessarily, other than just a good elbow in, which is normal in basketball and which I love. But I think there are these forces that keep trying to drag it into those entrenched cultural values and beliefs, right, that are holding us back. Oh my God, you said so much. And we will dig into more around, the sex testing and the horrible tragedy of someone like Caster Semenya, right, who's kicked out and isn't allowed to run unless she goes through some sort of testosterone suppressing kind of intervention, which she resisted. I think she finally won her appeal, hey, but like so late, and such a huge loss. I have my little gender cards from the 80s. Horrible invasion,
Oh
right?
my God, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So Jill, how about you? How are you feeling about it as I love the idea of a site for social justice, but we're also seeing the injustice. Do you feel like there's a shift one way or the other, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think we see obviously both. Like you could see the Summer Olympics, some of the injustices we are mentioning with the boxers as well, and the conversation around that. I think Caster's a perfect example. And I don't know if many of you know Melissa Bishop. She was a track runner for Canada. She came fourth in the 800 in Rio, and she just got past in that last 100-meter home stretch. And it was so heartbreaking. But because she was in that race with Caster, she was asked so many questions, and so were a lot of the women she competed against, whether she thought it was fair. And some of the women, I remember there was a woman who came eighth, and she was saying, oh, the women were robbed of medals, like horrible just horrible things. And I always really respected Melissa because she was asked this question like time and time and time again because everyone wanted her to say, like, people were, you came forth, you must be so, trying to almost like fabricate the story. And she'd always say, we're all just here to run. And she would never comment on it in a negative way. She was like, we're all just here to run. And I have no comment on that. Like she was very respectful towards those women. And I always had so much respect for her because it would be so easy to want to point a finger, a disappointing result. And I always felt the media was baiting her. She's this beautiful white woman, and I just felt like they were always baiting her to kind of go in on it, and she never did. And I always, so much respect for her. And she's working with me on Momentum, so we're kind of starting this nonprofit to help support elite athletes right now, focusing on women who have children or want to have children or are just wondering about fertility. It's called Momentum with Mom in capitals, but we're very aware that that looks different for everyone. And eventually we'd like to support fathers in sport as well. But right now we know there's this big gap for women in sport, so that's our focus currently. And there's a lot of good things are happening. There was the nursery at the Olympics, albeit very tiny nursery. I went and saw it the one day. I don't have children myself, but it was very small, but a good step forward, I think. I think there's a lot of publicity around it, which made everyone look really good. There's still lots of kind of injustices around that, around right now in Canada. I'm not sure if anyone's aware, but for amateur athletes, so those who are Olympic level athletes who aren't part of a professional league, there's no HR because we're not technically employees. So there's no maternity policy. Right now, Sport Canada is in the development of a new one. They have employed researchers, Margie Davenport and Tara Lee McHugh out of the University of Alberta. They consulted a lot of athletes on it, and the draft they have actually looks quite incredible. Like what they, I think one of the things that they requested was a nursery at every single NSO available for coaches and athletes. Whether that happens and whether it gets through each step in Sport Canada, but hopefully soon. But it's 2024, and we have how many athletes who've had kids compete at the Olympics and Paralympics, and we still have no comprehensive policy, which seems insane because in any workplace that is just not a reality, or should, would be against the law to not have a maternity and paternity policy. So I think sport, and as an athlete, I think is an avenue for social justice because it does reflect society. And typically sport at times is behind it. And I think it does, how you say, like, that question about whether it should be that you pose to your students. It does, everyone has an opinion on it, whether or not they are in sport at that level. It's very triggering for people. This is the last thing I'll say because I'm rambling. There was a interview of me and my teammate that went viral. We were crying at the Olympics because we got a disappointing result. And everyone was very supportive. It was very nice. But you'd get this odd comment, saying, oh, Alicia, were you performing against men? Like there's always, it just seems to be this very triggering response. Like people seem to really just come in, no matter what the conversation is about in sport, whether it's a bot or whoever it is, there always seems to be this, I just don't understand. Honestly, as an athlete, it's never been a conversation amongst me and my teammates. So I don't know why sometimes it's posed to us either, because it doesn't seem to reflect the outrage that it's kind of compiling. But I thought that was interesting, and it's sad, quite frankly, that it seems to come in every conversation, whether it's about gender or not.
Yeah, the violence really seems to hijack sport. And so we'll circle in on that in a second. I wanted to also point out, the link between what Travers was saying earlier of this, instead of being a real true leader, taking leadership role and making these policies, there's still this downloading to the NSOs. And how are the NSOs supposed to fund a nursery, right? So unless that's built into the plan, it's going to be tough to see it really come to fruition. Yeah, so let's talk. Oh, go ahead.
I think it's just important to remember that sports aren't supposed to be for women and girls. Like the origin of modern sport was like partly like a big part of it was that there was a middle class and upper class women's movement in Europe at the time who was pushing for the vote, for example, who was pushing for public inclusion, etc. And one of the ways that men resisted it was by through sport, which was purposefully boy and men only. And also, you know, like the YMCA and physical education in school, it emerged not for everybody, but purposefully to counter the feminizing impact of women on boys, you know, because we had the capitalist, you know, like the switch to capitalism, the industrial revolution. You had men no longer working around the home, but going away to work. So there's this fear that, you know, boys in particular were surrounded by only women and would become soft and feminized. So there was that. So when we talk about like the Young Men's Christian Association, we're talking about Christian masculinity. It's like it's actually a thing, a white Christian masculinity. It was very, very purposeful. So when you understand the origin of sport and you look at where we are now, I think it makes a lot more sense. It like women and girls were not excluded by accident. It wasn't just like, you know, oh, we didn't really think about it. We didn't think they'd be interested. It was very, very purposeful. And the only reason that women gained participation in the Olympics in the first place was because in the 1920s, women started organizing their own Olympics. So the IOC finally said, okay, you know, we got to include them in a few events, like it was a pacifying event. And it's really important to know that the IOC were a bunch of European white male fascists. Like literally, I do not use this word lightly. You know, if you think of Avery Brundage, who was the chair of the IOC in 1968 when Tommy Smith and John Carlos protested, like his nickname was Slavery Avery. Like he literally has fascist ties. And, you know, there's been a little bit more diversity among the IOC lately, but they are still particularly, you know, aristocratic. Like there's like a long list of problems with the organization, but they're also the most successful brand ever in global history. You know, the rings, like they are accountable to no body at all. Like they literally make their own rules and they impose them on host countries. So you have this really, really successful brand that, you know, the Olympics, participation, all this kind of things, when in reality, they're incredibly privileged and incredibly damaging and completely unaccountable. But, you know, the games go on.
So an intentional counter force, right? So all this work that people are trying to do to achieve equity, there are always going to be these counter forces. And I think you're really highlighting beautifully, Travers, how important it is for us to really understand that and go in astute enough and aware enough of what we're up against when we're taking these kinds of things on. Yeah, I think I'm thinking of Sedona Prince when she leveraged her platform on social media to show the disparity, right, at the NCAA champs between the men's gigantic gym of weights for weight training and the women, I think, were not given anything, or it was a tiny little room with a few little pink dumbbells in it.
Well, yeah, and that is a real problem. But at the same time, we see the NCAA until recently, you know, profiting off, you know, the bodies of mostly male athletes, you know, many of whom are Black and, you know, poor, etc., who end up with a degree if they do finish, you know, but they haven't received a good education, etc. So yes, men's athletics gets much more investment and much more attention, but these athletes are being exploited. You know, like universities are making so much money. I mean, I can't remember how many states where the most highly paid public official is the coach of a basketball or football team, but it is like it's a lot of them. So, you know, there are so many problems. And at least now with the change in policy around name, image, and likeness, American-born students can profit now in ways that they didn't before. But prior to that, like it was like, you know, the athletes were literally just cash cows for the university. And, you know, what happened to them, you know, education-wise or injury-wise was, you know, only a factor if it impacted profit.
Yes, and this is the danger, isn't it? We'll take a step forward and feel like we're gaining some momentum in these areas like a professional league, but then it's still professional and still becomes vulnerable to these kinds of pressures and forces. Yeah. Jill, tell us more about your experiences, frustrating experiences, perhaps in sport, or things that you're really honing in on that have been maybe some examples of your own experience that aren't the bigger issues, but what have you experienced as an athlete that felt like you just can't quite take a step forward?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think as like the years went by, so I joined the probably senior national team in 2017. And so kind of as, leaving the university system and kind of just doing under 23 level stuff. And so kind of over the years, I was around long enough, two quadrennials, so 2 8-year cycles, you kind of begin to see trends and patterns, and you also are aware. I think when I first came in, I didn't look with a critical lens and didn't really understand the structure. Like, you're kind of just thankful to be there, so everything's with rose-colored glasses. And I think that's how many people go. It's your dream to be there, so you're kind of just like, oh my God, this is amazing. And if anything's off or doesn't feel right, you're very much like, well, this is the national team. It's tough. It's supposed to be hard. It's supposed to be this cutthroat environment. You have these ideas. I think especially the last 4 years, the idea around what's appropriate in sport, what's acceptable behavior, between staff, management, coach, athlete relationship. There's been a lot of learnings. I mean, learnings because horrible things have been exposed, and then it makes you reflect. And I think on a personal level, like, that definitely happened to me. I didn't really understand what safe sport was. It was also villainized in a way, which is athletes being soft, and you're not really understanding that because you're entrenched in this idea of, oh, it is just athletes complaining. Even as an athlete, I think I even took that on as not really understanding, oh, they're like, if they could just make it work with the coach, it'd be fine, but they're just stubborn. Or even realizing yourself that, oh, I've even been susceptible to some of these ways of thinking, because that's how I learned and that's how I was taught, and kind of unpeeling those layers. And I had to go through that myself and realizing, oh, okay, this is actually a very toxic and horrible environment I've been in, once you kind of get that education and learning. And so from a personal level, I definitely took my own journey on that and understanding what safe sport actually meant. And then having a very different experience this quadrennial, where you feel like you're in a very safe and supportive environment, at least with my own coach and my teammate. But then also seeing issues in equity, where, yeah, like seeing a policy where I have teammates after the Tokyo Olympics wondering, okay, if I have a kid and want to come back because it's a shorter quadrennial, it's 2.5 to 3 years instead of the full 4, what does that look like? And we're looking at the carding policy, and it doesn't even mention the word pregnancy. So they have no clue what that looks like. They don't know who the coaches are going to be necessarily, the safety in that, moving training centers, like the lack of resources. It was really, we had I had a teammate who had a child and came back in that first quadrennial. And so even with a rower who had done that, there still wasn't a policy in that second quadrennial on how to support that. So just kind of seeing things like that and being like, oh, we've taken these steps forward, but we still haven't learned anything. That we had someone who had a child, and I think I can't speak for her, but supported to bring her child and her family and loved ones to be able to help support her, and when she was competing overseas, and just that not reflected at all the next quadrennial, even in policies, because I think as an athlete you're looking at those carding documents, and so that's the norm as well. There's nothing even about mental health really isn't included either. I think that's a whole, it's still these, because like how you mentioned, the NSOs are looking for direction from Sport Canada. Unless there's an expert or someone who's invested in it, it just kind of doesn't happen because it's not the norm, or the norm yet, at least. So I still see in a lot of ways where there's so much work to be done, especially at the amateur level, hopefully the professional level within the WNBA, the PWHL. I think they're growing steam and momentum, and hopefully they're not susceptible. I think they probably, obviously are, but hopefully they keep leading us forward. And I think they then pull the NSOs forward and Sport Canada forward as well. But there's still definitely a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, it's exhausting because, to fight for that professional league was one thing, but they're going to have to continue to fight to maintain, to prevent themselves from being susceptible to some of these same old assumptions embedded. Pregnancy was called an injury for a while too, right? I think it still is many.
Yeah, I think it's like they just changed it from injury card to a health card, which I think as well, so that was something that was even up until recently. And when I did an article on it, and I looked at every single NSO's policy, like their carding policy. And even though they were supposed to call it a health card, I think it was something crazy where it was like more than 50% still called an injury card. And I think there was like a handful that, I think most of them didn't even include the word pregnancy as one of the things that you could be using the health card for. There was like, I think athletics had included it because they had a lot of athletes who had appealed and went and like pushed for this change. But there may have been like 5 or 6 out of the 20 to 30 NSOs that actually were following exactly how they should be wording it. And it still was just using the word, not including how long is that, what does it look like? Like it still was just the word pregnancy being included. Was still a handful, and it's shocking when you start to actually peel away at it.
So a one-off, and then you got to battle for it again, right? Which there's sort of the cynic in me believes that that's intentional as well. That you'll eventually wear down and get tired and just suck it up, and we can't get tired, right? Yeah. And power imbalance. So Travers, you alluded to this earlier that, the lack of accountability built in to so many sport organizations, not just the IOC, but it's rampant. It's one of the biggest complaints a lot of academics have about sport, that somehow it's exceptional outside of the norms. Like Jill, you're saying there's no HR, there's no, we're just skating around all these kinds of typical structures that we would see in an organization. And again, intentional, right? I would think it's and something people are hanging on to very tightly, because once it breaks open, they're not going to be able to just keep doing whatever they want. And yet, sport functions best when it's power balanced, like Jill described her partner and the coach operating in this wonderful little partner triangle, right? It's really effective.
I think they have always been good coaches. There have always been good coaches, just like there have always been good teachers, or but just the pervasiveness of sexual harassment, sexual violence in coaching. Or you think about Hockey Canada. I know that the journalist Laura Robinson is on this call, and Laura Robinson documented the sexual violence that was integral to the culture of junior hockey in Canada decades ago. And then all of a sudden, when was it? Like 2 years ago, big scandal, just because a TSN reporter noticed something about the sexual violence that is currently before the courts with junior hockey players. And I honestly think that people just thought it was normal. Like, certainly people involved in hockey, like whatever, it's not considered a problem. Like, this pervasive environment of sexual violence, against girls and women by hockey players. And all of a sudden Hockey Canada is in trouble, and, their funding is challenged. But, I believe, I'm not sure about this, but I believe funding has been restored, but my faith has not been restored. Not that I ever had any. I didn't, to be honest, because hockey is, in Canada, it's like the epitome of white masculine power and privilege, and it certainly normalizes that. But the way in which sporting organizations and coaches have been able to behave without consequence is incredibly disturbing, and it's ongoing.
Why? Let's dig into that just a little bit. I know it's not in the script, but what do you think's going on? Why is it so important that that kind of impunity be preserved? What's at stake? Money?
You can't separate violence against girls and women in sport from violence against girls and women in society. Like we're hearing about, femicides, like now that they're actually being called femicides, which is an appropriate thing to do, as opposed to crimes of passion. The experiences of girls and women and trans and gender nonconforming people, like they're not a priority. It's really obvious. It's really clear. And I don't think we should be surprised about it. I mean, Canada was founded as a white supremacist, heteropatriarchal society. One of the justifications for denying any kinds of rights to Indigenous people was that they were primitive, because they had egalitarian gender relations. And, you know, the civilization is literally defined in terms of whiteness, class privilege, and heteropatriarchal gender and sexuality systems. So this is what we are seeing. It's pervasive. It's not going to go away on its own. We've seen, places where things have improved, but it's foundational to Canadian culture, and I think a lot of people don't want to acknowledge that, but it's, I think the evidence is there.
Yeah, this pyramid of power. Hey, Jill.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, in a Canadian context, especially when we're like my expertise would be, or my expertise, my experience would be in more the amateur side of things. And I think you see that within, our NSO, multiple NSOs where, women aren't applying for the jobs in management or high performance. People who've worked around, in these roles have just stayed there forever because they are all become friends, they're chums, and there's really no critical look sometimes at management until there's maybe a bad result or something like that. So as long as the results are happening, typically there isn't much oversight. And if there is, it's I've found, at least as an athlete, we're never giving feedback on what we think of our CEO or our high performance director or our managers. We give feedback on our coaches, but we never have that opportunity for feedback for the rest of the staff. And we're the as athletes, we're the ones who are being impacted. Technically, the high performance training center is there for us. It exists because of us, because then we help inspire young kids to hopefully take up our sport. You see us on the Olympics, maybe they want to row. That helps grow the sport, but ultimately we have no say in that side of things in management. And I think it just becomes pervasive. And I think we have had coaches that have left for horrible reasons, including sexual harassment, sexual assault, and they're left with glowing reviews. They're left with being recommended. I've seen staff members who I think there is no way this person should work around women, and they leave and they're given glowing recommendations. Then they get hired, to work with younger athletes with province. It's just, I find it's very difficult. And I think as athletes, especially as women athletes, if you say something, you're, shut down immediately in most cases, or you're made to seem problematic, or it's also very difficult to do because you're, like I always say, power imbalances, you're in no position of power. You're not paid a lot, so you really can't risk being kicked off the team. It's your dream on the line. So there's also that just power imbalance. Like, you don't have any financial backing. You're very dependent on being included in the training center, on getting along with your teammates as well, who also just kind of want to just put your head down and train. There's that mentality that I think that keeps the power imbalance is also difficult, because you're also pushing against, it can become problematic with your teammates if you want to speak out against your organization, because it is a distraction. So I even found that as an athlete training for the Olympics, what do I want to speak out about? Because it does take time, it does take energy to do those things. And you also need to put all that time and energy into what you're trying to do. So it almost becomes like, I find it me sometimes a conflict of interest at times, because I want to say something and I think it's wrong, but I also just need to focus on what I'm doing so that I can achieve my dream. So it also, I think it becomes difficult for athletes who aren't in this position of power to even reclaim any power or do something about it, because their dreams are on the line. And they only have a window typically to pursue those dreams. So I think it also becomes hard for athletes to speak out, because it's just the conflict of interest that can be so difficult, depending if, if maybe you're an individual athlete, or maybe it's different amongst teams, a sport like soccer. But yeah, I found it quite difficult myself.
Yeah, we saw with the women's rugby team, right? Really, really sacrificing their Olympics in Tokyo for the sake of change in the organization, and it worked. I think it really led to change, but a lot of the athletes who were part of that, right, ended up, that was their retirement year too. So amazing legacy that they left, but it is such a distraction, and it's such a tragedy in my mind, because you are pursuing excellence, whether you're going backwards in a boat or shooting a ball or hitting a ball. It's about excellence and trying to be the best you can be, which is such a such a beautiful endeavor and pursuit. Power imbalance. What's being protected? What on earth? Why can't we do things differently? Why can't we operate like those good coaches know how to, as a partnership. What are we afraid of? What are people afraid of losing? I've heard the argument, well, we're protecting the whole organization. And I think it's a cop out, and usually it's protecting them as well. They're feeling complicit. There's a lot of factors at play, but that's the argument. We're maintaining the status quo. We're keeping everything copacetic.
I tend to want to, answer these questions like, in a really direct way. It's
Good.
like, who benefits, who is harmed. So look at who benefits. They're usually similar people. And it isn't just girls and women who are abused by athletes. I think about Graham James, who abused Sheldon Kennedy and Theo Fleury, and the Mike Danton's coach, who he ended up going to jail for plotting to murder. Like, these are people who prey on the vulnerable, and when organizations allow them to continue, like, terrible things are going to happen. But Theo Fleury, Sheldon Kennedy, like, they're boys, they're being sexually abused. Their hockey career could go away if they said anything, if they didn't go along with it. Like, there's the hierarchical relationship between coach and athlete without supervision, without accountability. That's been the norm for so long, and it's only been in the past decade or so that issues related to sexual harassment in sport and sexual violence have really received like any attention. These organizations are just incredibly problematic. And, it's not just sport, it's, other places where power imbalance is at play, and there are people who are in positions of power who never abuse that power. There are a lot of people who don't. But the thing is that there are also a lot of people who do abuse power. So if you have a situation where there's a power imbalance, if you don't provide checks and balances and accountability, absolutely for sure that somebody is going to use their power to harm other people. Like, it is what happens. Lots of people don't. There are lots of good men out there who are in coaching positions or in leadership positions who would never dream of using that power in a way that is harmful. But there are also a lot who just, it's part of the perks of the job. Like, sexual relationships with athletes, like, they seem to have been fairly common. Just like, in universities, it used to be normal for male professors to sleep with undergrads, and a lot of men didn't, but a lot of them did. Like, it used to just seem to be normal, whereas that is now, at least certainly in my university and the universities in Canada that I know of, like, you're not to have sexual relationships with graduate students or undergraduates, like, but it used to be just kind of normal. Like, part of the perks of being in a position of privilege and power was sexual access. You see it with, I mean, who's the Nygaard, the guy who just was convicted of being a sexual predator and sentenced to 11 years in jail. Like, that's part of the benefit of having positions of power and authority for some people. And I think that it's incumbent upon us to look at all kinds of institutional arrangements and otherwise where there is a power imbalance, and find some way to provide a check so that that doesn't result in abuse, because where there is a power imbalance, there is often abuse, and that's just reality.
And it's truly been such an amazing education lately, right? I really found the UCCMS useful, the Universal Code, because it makes explicit these techniques of normalization, gaslighting. I remember some of the athletes, I was attending a meeting to support, and they were like, tell us when the gaslighting is happening, because we don't even know what it is or how to recognize it, and I think people know now, and they're recognizing the pressure to normalize is part of that technique to maintain the power, right? And so, how are we going to shift it? How are we going to topple this hierarchical pyramid and achieve more of the equity, partnership, power balance? Because it serves everyone. It's not like anyone's losing anything necessarily. I mean, they're losing the dominance, but they still have power too. It's still a wonderful free society where people would have agency. It seems crazy that we would perpetuate this very power imbalanced society. Jill, what do you think?
Well, just that conversation just really made me think of Nike in the case with Alberto Salazar, the infamous coach of the Nike Oregon Project, who Kara Goucher in her book detailed how he sexually assaulted her, how he, he's been, I think, charged with allowing doping. And they had a whole systemic kind of cover up within Nike, and Nike still backed him up until like how many years ago in court. Like they were paying his legal fees, they were helping him lawyer up. Because I think you're right on about the complicit. Like, why aren't things changing? And I think it's because if, my perspective, the acceptance that this happened under your eye or under your watch, you are then complicit, and you won't maybe have your job if, ultimately if it goes up the ladder. That's what I have to. That's the only reason I can think is the power in being complicit and wanting to keep your job and wanting to keep making money. That's like, for me, the only way that you could work your mind around it, because I really just can't understand otherwise. But I do think, having journalists doing this work is so important. And I think it's what's pushed a lot of this is the news articles that come out when athletes are willing to speak. I do think that, because I think ultimately if you're at risk of funding, or it's you have a PR issue, that's when stuff actually gets done. Unless you have a big change of manager, you have someone really exciting come in and who has these great values and instills them. That's like the ideal situation, but I think rarely that's what ends up happening. And I think it's journalists who are doing a lot of the work that then forces the conversations to be had, albeit quite slowly, and sometimes nothing occurs. But I think, yeah, sometimes I'm like, oh, there's so much stuff to be done. How do you change it? And sometimes it seems like I don't think you can, but I do see change happening slowly. But
Yeah, I mean, I believe so deeply in education, and I just think the more people are aware and have the language that they can call things out or challenge, question, that will help. The more we understand the power of connection and linking and creating, like you're doing, groups and organizations that can work together and join, because it can be so tough to do all by yourself, and you do feel like you're in conflict, or and that's another technique to isolate you so that you totally feel alone and you don't feel the power you have. And Laura is in our audience right now. We've seen Rick Westhead do a great job. Donna Spencer's done some great work around all of this. And I do agree. I think the journalists are really the ones who are showing great leadership in the space right now. Powerful.
And some of them pay a huge price for it. I'm not going to tell Laura Robinson's story for her, but she has been one of the most important voices speaking up against sexual harassment and sexual violence in sport. And, she had John Furlong sue her. Like, I don't think it's an accident that Rick Westhead was successful in breaking the story. Like a white male journalist who's well established with TSN. I'm just really grateful he did. And I think about also, there are other journalists. I think about Dave Zirin, who writes for The Nation in the US. He tells stories that would otherwise not get told. So, I do think journalists are incredibly important, but they also have to navigate structures of power and inequality that, they're in as well. So literally, like we knew about junior hockey in 1989. We knew, but, and, obviously other people knew all along, but it's, hockey is Canada's game. Nothing bad can ever happen in hockey because hockey is great. And, it's really, really difficult to get people to listen to criticism about hockey because of the way in which hockey has been so tied up with Canadian masculinity and, nationalism. It's like, as a sport, like, what a cool sport, but as it's currently practiced, I hate it. Not when women play, because it feels really different, but like the NHL as an institution, like, to me, is like really, really problematic.
Yeah, the identity, so much at stake, right? We're circling back to that. What are we preserving? The status quo, the strength of the organization, and people convince themselves, rationalize that that's the public's trust and we have to protect it. But I think a lot of it's hogwash as well, and just justifying, again, maintaining their own power.
Well, and I also think that it's, like sport, like being an elite athlete for men, is like they're a star. Like it was a while ago, but I remember when, somebody said to me, wow, Tiger Woods, eh? Like it was when his wife found out that he cheated on her. And I said, seriously? What's the point of being Tiger Woods if you don't get to sleep with all those women? And, I was only half joking, but that's part of the reward for, for success is sexual access. And, I am not against ethical non-monogamy. Clearly that was not what was happening in his case, but I'm not opposed to like ethical non-monogamy, but it's like that's what stars learn to expect. And when universities in the States, like the big NCAA universities are recruiting athletes, they often hire sex workers, like so it's not accidental. And again, there are a lot of athletes who do not abuse their power and privilege, but for many, they're taught this is normal. Like when you're a star athlete, like you should be able to do this. And I have really mixed feelings about Kobe Bryant, because he was a rapist, and also because he was such an incredible supporter for women's basketball. And I just, it breaks my heart to think about, what would have happened if he was still alive. But, like, I don't know, obviously I wasn't in the room, but from my understanding of it, it's like, I actually think that he thought at the time that it was consensual, um, without ever seeking consent. And he acknowledged in his final remarks at the end of the process when, like the charges had been withdrawn, he acknowledged that she could have experienced it as non-consensual. So I have to think it was an educational moment for him. But, star athletes, like they're used to people trying to please them. They get everything they want. And, and I think that's certainly central to, hockey culture where, these young men are like gods in small towns. So, the way in which like masculinity and power and sport are all tied together are really important to understand. And a lot of boys and young men are learning about sex and what they should expect in these environments where, sexual abuse or even just like the disregard for the people involved is just so normalized. It's, it's really troubling, but it's like such a pervasive culture.
I'll just jump in real quick. When I was growing up, I'm from a small town outside of Peterborough, Ontario, so Kawartha Lakes region, if anyone's from Ontario. And hockey was like, a big thing. And one of the costumes that people would dress up as for Halloween was a puck bunny. So that's when you wear like a jersey and you have like the bunny ear. Like that was a like normal Halloween costume for like high school girls, was to dress up as like, and what does that imply? Like yeah, you look back on that and that was normal. And growing up, that was normal. And I didn't think anything of it because that was just a Halloween costume that girls dress up as. And I look back and it's like, oh my gosh, like what message is that sending? And that at that age, you're in grade 9, grade 10, it's a normal costume. And what it implies is really disgusting. And the
No,
fact that parents would allow it and see like that also, you're not operating in a vacuum. So I think yeah.
no, that's such a great example. I am a baseball fan, and I can't remember when it was, but when JPR and Sibia and, I think it must have been like 2016 or 2015 or something like that. And the Blue Jays had a marketing campaign where they were trying to draw in girls and young women as, like as an audience. And it was not too subtly, like it was teaching them to be baseball groupies, not baseball players. It wasn't saying, this is a great game, come and watch. Maybe you'd like to play too. Bring your glove. No, no, no. It was like, like drawing their attention to these, handsome young men with the idea that like it was literally training them to be baseball groupies. And this was like, a mainstream campaign. And I don't think anybody found this alarming, but I did. Like, I really, really did.
Absolutely. And unless they're educated, like you say, it becomes the norm and then it's expected. And so exposing, revealing, giving language to, calling it out. I've been calling out the idea of consent, even because, again, once you're in a power imbalance situation, as Jill was saying, impossible to give consent, impossible to truly weigh in critically because you have so much to lose. And so you can't call something out, you can't say no, right? Or you might not be able to play, or you might not be able to have your job or whatever. So we're all caught in this terrible mess. Laura's drawing our attention to further documentation and some books she's written. And I think there's just so much out there that we can really learn from and to read critically, right? Really trying to understand what's going on in the background and understand the power of culture, sociology of these assumptions, norms, values, beliefs that then drive our behavior. And we have to dig down and question what's operating like an algorithm. I want to get back to trans athletes because there was a huge story at the Summer Olympics, and Iman Khalif and Lin Yutang, right? Algerian and Taiwanese female boxers being challenged as trans, and just so much around trans athletes and Caster Semenya, and none of these are trans athletes, but they're being then accused. Like even that, it seems just so misguided and terrible, and then blamed if they win that somehow you're stealing a medal, and Caster's being forced to suppress testosterone even though that's how she's been born. What do you see as the future for this, Travers? This is what you study. What do you think?
I know, it's like it's
Oh.
I have become an internationally recognized expert on transgender inclusion, and I started with my trans inclusion in lesbian softball leagues. But, that took me into doing a lot of research around the history of female eligibility policies. And female eligibility policies, like they're different because, male eligibility is based on a number of factors, but whether they're men or not is not involved in the equation. And if they naturally produce higher than the norm in terms of testosterone levels, it's lucky, it's an advantage. So it's like Michael Phelps, he has huge feet, like, yay. It's really problematic, and it comes down to the idea that there's an assumption that men as a group are always better than women as a group in athletics, so that women have to be a protected category. And there were these false claims in the 1930s and 40s that men were masquerading as women so that they could win in the Olympics, and that has never been proven to be the case. But this idea that if a woman is too good at sport, she's not a woman, that's a long-standing cultural belief, that to be too good at sport, either you're a lesbian or you're now, the accusation, like to accuse someone of being trans as if it's a bad thing. But we've seen since really the 2016 election, this really, really concerted push by conservative elements, as well as a strange subgroup of people who call themselves feminists, to keep trans women out of sport, to keep trans girls out of sport. And we've also seen, the way in which athletes like Caster Semenya have been targeted as suspicious. Like the International Olympic Committee and the IAAF, now World Athletics, stopped sex testing in 2000, but they used it for suspicious cases. And it's not an accident that these suspicious cases are Black women for the most part, or brown women from the global South. Like I was watching one of the track events with my partner during the Olympics, and the four front runners in a particular race were all Black. And I turned to Gwen and I said, they can't say that they shouldn't be competing against us because they're Black anymore. So now they're going to say they're not women, like this. It's really hateful. It's really horrible, deeply disturbing. And if you think about the impact, on the individual athlete, it's just devastating. I can't say I was surprised by the case against the two boxers, just because we've seen so much targeting of, Black and brown women from the global South who are too good at their event. It's really troubling. And we're also seeing at the same time that we're seeing policies for transgender participation that require, that basically ban trans women who lacked access to gender affirming healthcare, at puberty. If you didn't have access to hormone blockers and you went through a so-called male puberty, you don't get to compete. But at the same time, we're seeing attacks on the availability of gender affirming healthcare for trans kids and trans youth. And we're talking about hormone blockers. We're not like trans kids are not having surgery. This is not happening. It's, what we're talking about is access to puberty blockers that just puts things on pause, gives kids, a few more years to think, okay, how do I want to handle my gender? Or that allows trans people who have access to them when they're young, they can pass in public, which is linked to safety and, less discrimination if you can pass in public. So not only are they saying, if you're a trans woman, you have had access to hormone blockers, but the exact same people are preventing access to hormone blockers. There's a real desire to eradicate trans people from public life. And when I'm interviewing trans youth about, the current toxic climate, one of the things I tell them is there's a positive to be pulled out of this for the moment. It's that, trans social movements, trans people and our supporters have been so successful in pushing our way into public life, in ending, some of the stigma and discrimination, that we now see this massive backlash that is purposely trying to drive us back out of public life. And trans girls and trans women in athletics are a particular target because it's easy to frighten people with misinformation because of all our cultural assumptions that somebody who is, assigned male at birth will always, no matter what, always be better at sport than someone who is assigned female at birth. So you've got a lot of just taken for granted prejudice that can be tapped into. So, people think, oh my God, like these poor little girls, they're having to compete against boys. They're not competing against boys. And it also, one of the things we know is that there is no appreciable difference, between the aggregate males and the aggregate females before puberty. So, like I ask, why could I not find a mixed sex soccer program for my son when he was 6? Why do we separate children like this, into gender categories? It's not because it's necessary. It's because it reinforces gender inequality. If girls and boys aren't different from each other, then why do we pay men more? Why are men overrepresented in positions of power? Like it's all connected. I'm sorry, you did ask me what I think is going to happen.
Yeah.
I think that like the position the IOC has taken is like really, really disappointing. I'm not surprised at all that individual sporting federations are, feeling quite comfortable adopting female eligibility policies that are based on no science. I think like when I tell the kids that I'm interviewing, I talk about the current context. I say, yeah, they're coming for us. This is the backlash. We were so successful. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, but ultimately I believe that we are going to win. And what winning looks like, I'm not really sure what it looks like, but I am inspired by Mariama Kaba, a prison abolition activist who insists that hope is a discipline, that feeling defeated, understandably, we can't stay there. We have to assume that, we will eventually improve things. So, I hope that that is the case. I really do hope that there is resistance to the way in which trans athletes and, women athletes who are deemed too successful are treated, and that there's, resistance to this. We certainly have seen, scientific evidence to support trans inclusion and to support the inclusion of women who naturally produce higher testosterone levels than normal, especially when we think that what is considered to be a fair versus an unfair advantage is a social rather than a biomedical decision. But, we're not seeing that science is, being taken that seriously right now. Like, the anti-vaccine movement during the pandemic, it shocked me. I have to admit, it absolutely shocked me. So, I don't think we're in very good shape right now, but, people deal with this stuff. We find ways, we organize, we talk, we educate people. And, ultimately I have to believe that we will make some progress, that, we can improve sport, in small ways and hopefully in bigger ways over time.
Oh my God, you said so much. Thank you. And not like, I don't mean by quantity, just so many really powerful points. So I'm really glad we record these because we need to go back, right, and listen. The concerted effort, the fear that's dominating all this. There's such a threat. And then the hate. I also really say similar things, that the backlash is a sign that we're succeeding. When you have this serious and opposite reaction, it's because your action is having an impact. So, and I love the idea of hope as discipline. There were so many times when I was working for change in these organizations that were just abusing people left, right, and center, that you start to lose hope. And the only way was to lift my eyes to what is it we're fighting for. And so I'd have to work on something around, a model of good sport, of balance and power balance and equity. And then I could go back to fighting in the trenches again, It's so true. We have to, and staying linked together to people like you. Outstanding. We are making advances, but things like you said, where then women are protected, but then that ends up shooting them in the foot, because now it's actually perpetuating. Like, we just have to be so aware of these forces at play that continue to fire back at us, right? And how do we keep the momentum going? But it reminds me of the soccer game, Canadian soccer game against the US. And remember when Christine Sinclair, it was like back in 2010 or 12, it must have been. And Christine Sinclair scores, and then the US scored, and then Christine scored, and the US scored. But it looked like Canada was going to win. And then the US started chirping at the ref, and then they got a penalty, and then they kicked the ball right at Tancredi, who got a handball. Then they got the penalty, and then it tied up, and the momentum shifted, and the US won. And it always makes me think, yeah, we have to be ready for the ball to be kicked at our face, not into the net. Be ready. It doesn't mean you have to be cynical. All
No,
right.
but this is why sports is like so powerful. Like that's such a powerful example. And, like I'm a fan. You watch a game and you look at a team that's the underdog, and all of a sudden they find a way to, and it's like, I have to talk about Caitlin Clark for a minute. Like, I tried not to love her just because the way in which whiteness and gender conformity were like sort of coalescing around her, like this is not her fault. So I was like, I can't. But you know what? Like, watch a Fever game. Like, I can't. Now I'm just like, oh my God, they're so fun to watch. And it's not just her, but the whole team, because she's an elite passer, and you have these elite, they're just unbelievable. But watching them be down, I think I watched them the other day, they were down like 20 points or something, like against a team that was playing a lot better, and they found a way. And this is exciting, and it makes you think, that hard work and having good relationships with your teammates and believing in each other, like, you can accomplish things. So for social justice movements, like, I think that sports, is emotionally really resonant. It's like, the thing I love about sports is when someone does something that isn't supposed to be possible. In baseball, I love the ridiculous catch that no one should ever have ever made. That's, or, in basketball, like, you just watch someone do something that they shouldn't have been able to do, but they do. And it reminds us of our capacity and our collective capacity, especially with team sports. So as much as team sports are associated with hazing and homophobia, and particularly male team sports with, all kinds of things that we don't want to perpetuate. At the same time, they remind us that, we can do things that aren't supposed to be possible. And, I think that as social activists, social justice activists, we need to keep that in mind. And that, like what athletes learn is don't give up. If you don't give up, if you keep pushing, like it's amazing what can happen. And I mean, that the example of that game is perfect. I mean, like even in like one of my lesbian softball games, we were just annihilating the other team. The other team was called Something Naked. So you know what they do? They strip down to their underwear and they beat us because it so discombobulated us. Like it was like, what? And they changed their energy. And it was just like they literally turned the game around. And I'm not suggesting that we, like strip down to our underwear all the time, but doing something unexpected, like momentum is a weird thing. Like, it's not completely like under control. So there are moments, there are openings that you can exploit and, make gains, and you just have to look for them.
Love it. And yeah, the truth is in sport, hey? And so while it can be very sick and toxic and has all these problems embedded within it and rife within it, and it's a poster child of hierarchy and patriarchy and imperialism, capitalism, at the same time, it embodies these beautiful principles, which is why we fight so hard for. Jill, I want to come back to you and talk more about, we have made gains around, well, mothers, right? Or parents actually going to the Olympics, being able to actually be parents and finally be respected, whether you're a coach, athlete, participant. But also we've made gains in terms of participation. First Olympics ever, crazy to think, 2024, but balanced participation of men and women. However, coaching, high performance, staff roles, right? Still incredibly imbalanced. Let's talk a little bit more about that. What do you think is working? What do you worry about? Things sliding backward or, having that kind of being cut at the knees from the backlash.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. With this Olympics being the first, one with equal participation, but then you have women not being allowed to compete with a hijab on, which I thought was a total stain on the entire thing. Like it was supposed to be this exciting moment. I mean, it's 2024. It shouldn't be that exciting. It's really embarrassing. Quite frankly, it should be embarrassing that we're celebrating it. But then to be like, okay, like let's celebrate this. Let's, ignore the fact that it's taken so long. And then you have these women not being able to compete with their hijabs on. It's totally barbaric and insulting. And I was like, what it's insane. And I think that with women who want to have children and come back, it's still so, it just really seems from the women I've talked to and the athletes I've talked to, just so dependent on the organization they're in. So we had this great example of these New Zealand rowers. They had competed at the Tokyo Olympics. They both wanted to have children and come back for Paris, which is difficult to do given that it was 3 years between the pandemic and the next Olympics in a sport like rowing, which is so physically demanding. And in New Zealand, they decided to help support these women. And they kind of were like, okay, well, how about we put you both in a boat together? Because you're going to have similar needs in terms of childcare. And they thought it'd be a really cool project for the both of them. So they had a coach that supported them, an organization that supported them. And they end up winning the gold medal. And there was 6 of them on the podium, so 3 doubles of 2. And as Jen mentioned, 3 out of 6 had children. One of the other was from Great Britain. And she had actually talked about when she first came back to rowing, how difficult it was and how the place where she was supposed to be nursing was like kind of like in the basement area, far away from everyone else. Like she spoke publicly about the treatment that she felt that she had from this, Great Britain is amazing rowing team. I think they were one of the top medalists, and she kind of expressed what difficult times she had at the beginning. And ultimately, she was supported. They came back and they won the bronze medal. And she was at the same hotel as me, and I would see in the afternoons because the hotel is supposed to be like a no family zone. Not no families in children, but no families in like your parents can't come visit you at the hotel. If you want to go meet with your parents, it's meant to be kind of a village scenario for athletes to keep it very focused. But with her, her I think maybe her mom or her stepmom and her child would come, a toddler, and I'd see her hanging out with him in the lobby in the evening of her races, and just such a great example that she could do both. But that was dependent on, she clearly didn't have a great experience at the beginning, but then ultimately was successful. In New Zealand, they seem to have a really good program to support mothers and fathers. So they had they extended to the fathers as well on the team because a lot of the men had wives who had children. But still, there is this way of thinking of it that is so heterosexual. Like there still is this, you're going to be a woman who, and you're like, what happens if you're in a professional league and you're two women and you're adopting or you're having the child and they're both parents? Like what happens then? That we really haven't thought about what's outside of this. You're having the kid, you have a husband, that kind of heterosexual way of thinking about it, or even fertility issues. So what about egg freezing? It's not supported. Like you're not getting any, it's expensive for some people and if you want to freeze your eggs or do IVF, and that may not even be a solution as well. So even talking about egg freezing as this solution, as this, oh, well, if you just freeze your eggs, first off, it's not easy on your body. Like you're training and taking these hormones. It's not this walk in the park, you'll freeze your eggs and you'll for sure have children after. Like it's still this, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. Like there's still this emotional toll. And I think as, my experience in sport and a lot of athletes, I asked other athletes when I was doing, researching this, and most teams, they never talked about fertility. Like it just wasn't a conversation, even though there were many women who were competing into their early to late 30s. It just wasn't something they talked about. So I think even the culture of having conversations about, okay, how do we support you as a woman in sport? And if family is something you want to consider, maybe it is adoption, whatever it may be, even having the conversation about options there is just not really happening. And I think, we're hitting this gender equity in sport for participants, but we're still so far away in terms of coaching. It's so far away. And I think it's so difficult for female coaches with children to have these roles. I see it, in my sport, there's hardly any women coaches. And if they are, even the way we view women coaches, the way we criticize women coaches, it's still deep in this, misogyny. I think there was a great article that Nicole Avoy did where it was looking at how we view women coaches who make safe sport violations. We're much more likely to hold them accountable to and as it should be, if they have, are being abusive in any way, but we're more likely to hold them accountable to a higher rate than men. We're more likely to call them bitches and these kind of derogatory terms, whereas male coaches, they're just tough, and women coaches are seen, even the way we as women view women coaches is still steeped in this way. And then if they are held accountable, the likelihood of them maintaining a job at that same level is very low. But a male coach who does this thing is likely to get hired somewhere else at the same level. So there's still all these things going on for women coaches, where I think that's our really not next big challenge, because there's so many challenges to support women in sport across motherhood and whether that's what they want to do, but also women coaches. I don't think, many women want to stay in sport when they have a negative experience as an athlete. So the likelihood of them becoming coaches is also quite low as well. So I think it's all steeped in there together, but I think women coaches definitely need a lot of support, because they're dealing with, a structure as well that's not made for them and made to support them.
I'm really glad you raised the issue of coaching, and just one quick comment about it before I say something else. I bet most of the men who are coaches in rowing have children.
Oh yes. Yeah, it's very, very common.
Oh yeah. So it's clearly not a problem, but and there's no question, and certainly my own experience bears this out, that coaches who are not men are held to completely different standards, like completely different. It's absolutely brutal, but it's individualized and personalized, so that in my case, I become the subject of the attack. Like it's not about because they won't say we're going to be we don't want you to coach because you're trans. They won't say that, and it's never just that, but they make it seem like it's because you suck, like rather than what you've actually done or not done. And it's so consistent, in the coaching literature that I've read. It echoes that same thing, that women and trans people in leadership roles, particularly if they're in leadership roles over boys and men, holy shit, you literally would have to be like the best coach in the entire world. And I am not the best coach in the entire world. I am just a competent coach, but it's really brutal.
Yeah. And so I'm seeing two prongs. So, providing more resources, making sure that those who are open, like you see with the New Zealand example that Jill provided, where there's an openness by leadership to to learn and improve and do things better and actually lead. And then there are those who are protecting what the status quo preserves in terms of heteronormativity and the hierarchy and the patriarchy. I mean, and so we need to also then challenge those assumptions and those ways of doing things. And it's like a double battle, hey, of educating, but also critically challenging. And we need support. Everybody needs to stick together in this and link up. So that's why I do these webinars, actually keep us connecting. And so many great people in the audience today. There's been lots of sharing in the chat, which is of course captured, and we'll post some of these links on our website as well. But Jill has shared an article. Andrew Carey's here from Inclusion Incorporated. Check out some of the work they're doing. I love the fact that you brought up New Zealand, because circling back to something Travers raised earlier around fun and free, the access to sport. I was in a classroom of sport management students out in Nova Scotia a while back, and the instructor said, what needs to change? And this kid said, fun and free, man. Sport needs to be fun and free. And it's so true. And if you look at the foundation of New Zealand sport, I mean, they're one of the most successful countries per capita, hey, when we think about results, which is the most important thing. But, even that, they're doing it while supporting community sport with a real attitude toward access and, and free, making it available. Where is it in our schools in Canada? Disappearing, and everything's an academy now and costs a bundle. Got to take a mortgage out if the kid's on a basketball team. Been there. Okay. I think that we're wrapping up. Actually, we're at 2:30, and it's amazing how we can fill 90 minutes. But what a great conversation! Thank you for so many great examples, resources. Got everybody fired up in the audience here. Lots of sharing. Thank you so much for being here, Laura. She shared lots of different resources in the chat as well. And thanks again to our guest, Ariana, of course, for your support through this. She shared that I had all sorts of background noise. Sorry about that. Didn't catch that. I'm used to my office, which is silent, other than breathing dogs. Thank you so much, Travers, for joining and sharing so much of the work that you're doing, your knowledge, the experiences you've gained in all of this research that you're working in. So articulate. Jill, I am so excited for you. What a leader in sport. Yes, carry on. You're already so involved and taking a real lead. Someone asked us earlier about that old commission, the Future Sport Commission. Who knows where that's going, hey? I guess we've got a little committee assigned and 3 people. I know Andrew Pipe's in there. That's great. But not a lot of communication, which is the other prong that we really need, which the journalists are taking care of so well, and making sure we're actually sharing what's going on. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time. We'll be sure to reach out and let you know who we've got on deck next. And take care. Keep fighting.